Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. As some of you know, I run a virtual book club, and the most recent book we read was Why It's Okay to Own a Gun by Professor Ryan Davis. For our third meeting, I recorded a question and answer and conversation we had with Professor Davis. I don't typically record the sessions in order to encourage candor, but to make our conversation with the author of this book more widely available. I did record it, so please enjoy this conversation. And as you see opportunities to join the book club for future books that we'll be reading, please join in. Greetings, everyone, for the third meeting to discuss why it's okay to own a gun. We're really happy to have Professor Ryan Davis join us for this meeting. I'm also sort of breaking with our protocol to record the meeting, since I think a lot of people have an interest in what we're doing here that just can't make it for one reason or another, and including those of us in the group who couldn't make it, as well as other people who have been enjoying following along. So I'll just give a very brief introduction to Professor Davis, since I think given the nature of the book, he may have an opportunity to reveal a little bit more about himself in the course of answering our questions. But he is a Princeton-trained political philosopher who teaches in the Department of Political Science at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. So welcome, Professor. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, which is a pretty general question, but one, I guess, as an author myself, I'm always interested in, which is, how and why did this book come into being? Why did you write it in the first place?
Thanks for that. And also thanks everybody for your interest in this. I really appreciate, it's one of those things where as an academic, you sort of suppose that no one really reads things that you write. And so I really appreciate your taking time. I came to this topic because at this point in my life is pretty much exactly evenly divided between my pre-graduate school life and my post-graduate school life. And the biggest guiding value of my pre-graduate school life was that I was a bird hunter. I mean, I'm still a bird hunter, confession. Both of my parents they decided where they were going to live based on bird hunting. When I went to graduate school, every vacation that I had ever been on was a firearms-based vacation. And then I got to graduate school. I had never been, outside of Arizona very much, or Arizona to Idaho, really. And people had very different views than I had grown up with among the academic community that I was part of. And this book sort of was a way, like many books, it was a way for me to kind of process those two halves of my life.
Yeah. So, and we did take note of the opening story about your relative who, had a very significant encounter with a firearm. So the history obviously runs deep. Were you so interested in this work that you solicited the opportunity to contribute to this Why It's Okay series, or did they somehow find you?
I think that they asked me, but the number of people who were interested in writing a kind of defense of gun ownership among academic philosophers and hadn't already written on the topic, I think was pretty modest. So it wasn't that they especially wanted me to do it. It was like there was just there's a few other. There's a famous essay by Michael Huemer from around 2003 that really sort of made possible a kind of defense of gun ownership from from a rights-based framework. But besides that, there was not very much that preceded it in terms of kind of like roughly pro-gun, or at least sort of like gun sympathetic philosophical defenses of rights. So So that's how I came to this academically, is that I was invited to write it as part of the series, and but the number of other people who I think were interested was not high.
Yeah, yeah. I can relate in terms of my own work
Yeah.
within sociology, so that's a familiar story to me. It's a pretty big question, and I imagine there's a lot of different ways that you could approach it. Was it clear to you the best way to come to answering the question, or did you write yourself into your answer, or how did long did that take?
Well, there's a few sort of touchstones for me that I really love. That I just kind of so the prompt for these series. I don't know if you've read other books in the series, but the kind of Why It's Okay series kind of invites you to take your academic work and kind of pitch it in a way where there might be people who are not in the field but might be interested in it. And so I wanted to invite people to at least sort of see a few other books that I love and kind of how they shaped me. So one of those is Robert Orsi's History and Presence, which is, if anybody's seen this book, Robert Orsi's History and Presence, it's a religious studies book of more or less mid-century Catholicism in America. And it's just really beautiful, and I really loved it. And it made me think about how people make things meaningful in their lives, or sort of like how people sort of like make their agency feel like they're able to do what they want to do, and the role of religion in that. Another book was Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope, um, which then I kind of like think about in terms of what are the ways in which you can feel like your agency is under threat. And so the kind of background views I was interested in are the kind of political psychology about identity threat and the way that identity threat works in political cases. But I use those two books as a kind of, as some entry points to those ideas, because I just happen to really, really love those books.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, I think the theme of gun owner agency really comes through strongly in the defense, which I think, again, in my own field, I think gun owners are often treated as kind of cultural dopes and not necessarily as active agents in making decisions that make sense for their own lives. So I'm going to ask one more question, unless Scott, is yours a follow up to what Professor just said?
I can't get the question. Have you enabled the question and answer?
I thought I had, but as you are welcome to just jump in and ask your questions since you have speaking privileges. But I'll double check once I turn.
I could not. I was going to write it so I would have. It's essentially a note to myself, and then to you ask a
okay.
question.
Well, maybe you were denied because it's not your personal servant. Oh, Aaron Bell just posted a question, so maybe an issue on your end. But I'm going to ask one more sort of starting question, and then if you have, if your note to yourself turns into a question, I'll let you jump in. And obviously, I don't want to monopolize this, but I thought that you really kind of begin with what I took to be a very strong claim and almost a kind of startling claim to me, says someone who kind of sees the issue a little bit differently. But this is on page 22 for anyone who's reading along. You say, guns are not primarily valuable because of their usefulness to other purposes. Their value is not instrumental. And so you kind of say this is looking at it this way as a bit of a Trojan horse, and that guns don't matter instrumentally nearly as much as they matter to who we are as persons. And so, I'm interested in kind of how you came up with this as a sort of central claim to your argument, and then also whether you have any sort of empirical basis for that claim, or whether any kind of empirical generalization even matters for purposes of your argument.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I'm interested in your view on this too. Sort of, so I'm interested in your sort of alternative view, because I'm sort of coming at this from a point of view of political philosophy, but I am interested in the sociology and the political psychology of gun ownership, and in political behavior, in the journal Political Behavior, which is largely a journal of American, like studying like American politics, and in particular voter behavior in American politics. There's sort of renewed interest lately in gun ownership and in rural identity, and also in rural identifiers in the last few years. So I am interested in this empirical work, but I myself am more a tourist in that domain. So about this question, though, the way that I came to it was there's this debate book in philosophy between Lester Hunt, who's a kind of philosopher who's sympathetic to gun ownership, private gun ownership, and Hugh Follett, who is a skeptic about private gun rights. And a move that Hugh Follett makes is he says, well, look, gun ownership, if there's a right to gun ownership in terms of, now I'm not talking about a constitutional right, I'm talking about a kind of moral right. If you think that you can have rights to external property, are guns among the things you could have rights to? And he thinks that if you think there's a moral right to gun ownership in that way, that it must be because you either have an intrinsic right to the gun, just the mere object is important, or that the guns are important for some instrumental purpose. And then he has a kind of divide and conquer strategy where he says, well, look, if it's the mere object, you could just take out the firing pins. So here's a nice compromise with a gun owner. You could keep the object, but just you're not going to use it if you don't think it's the instrumental thing. Well, all right. Obviously that's not a way that the gun rights defender is interested in proceeding. So they've kind of lost once they're on that horn. Now, on the other horn of the dilemma, he's like, look, if it's merely instrumental, then a feature of instrumental reasoning is if there's alternative means, then as long as we satisfy the end that you're seeking, we don't need to give you each of the means that's available. As long as you can sort of get the thing that it's instrumental to, that's what really morally matters. So if there's an alternative way, for example, of providing personal security, or providing recreational opportunities or whatever you think it is, then that's good enough. So either way, he thinks it kind of deflates the significance of the gun right. And my interpretation of the kind of sort of rural identity sociology is that it's really neither of these things. Now, of course, people will say, if you just do a survey, people will say who are gun owners that they want the gun for personal protection. But I think that there's a variety of ways of looking at the psychology where my conjecture is that the better hypothesis is that it's connected to their identity. That their status as owning a kind of functioning firearm is an important component of their social and political identity. And if that's what's happening, then it's neither the case that they intrinsically value the gun merely as object, nor is it the case that they merely instrumentally value the gun, but they value the gun largely for its sort of like what philosophers sometimes call its extrinsic value, which is a way of saying its symbolic value. That is the value that it has in virtue of your relatedness to it. And if it has value in virtue of, this is too long an answer, but if it has value in virtue of your relatedness to it, I think that we can then categorize it as being having the same kind of value that even if you don't like guns, that probably there's something in your life that has value like that. It's like, that's the kind of value that a wedding ring has, or the kind of value that, your first car might have had, or your parents' homestead, any of those things that are part of how you construct your identity, then it might be easier to get a handle on how the gun owner feels about the gun by virtue of considering those comparisons than merely instrumental ones. So that's my angle on it.
Yeah. And I won't directly respond to that, but I think you do thankfully bring up this issue of the kind of rural urban divisions, which was something that we spoke about quite a bit in our first meeting. And so in order to sort of transition away from me talking to others, did anybody want to raise any questions in relation to that, the question of rural gun ownership that had come up in our earlier conversation? I don't want to call anybody specifically, but this did come up as a point of, I think, conversation and a bit of contention.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll just say, I realize that no one knows me, but I just got out of my GE class, which is just a way of saying that I'm totally happy to have people be like, tell me that I'm dumb and my views are implausible, because it's like, that's just, that's just the job that I have. So I'm just interested in people's reactions, and I don't, it's if you feel like this is totally wrong, that's great.
Well, I mean, I'll say on behalf of where John, there's John is going to save me from myself. Go ahead, John Richardson.
Well, let me ask you a question then. I mean, your parents are big bird hunters. You grew up bird hunting. I don't know whether they used a very fine shotgun or if they used a Remington 870. Did it matter to them what shotgun they used and why? I mean,
Oh,
you have beautiful shotguns and then you have very utilitarian shotguns.
yeah. No, I can tell you, I appreciate your asking this question. My parents, when I was growing up, both shot Winchester 101s. My dad shot a Winchester 101 over and under. This isn't the old, they made the Winchester 101 for 20 years or something, and then they discontinued it, and now they make it again, quite similar to the original model. I don't know if people are interested in this. And my mother shot a side-by-side Winchester 101 that I think this might be in the book, that the name of the gun is Bobo. And it mattered to her a great deal to shoot Bobo as opposed to. So if it's sort of like if her Winchester 101 side by side was forgotten, then it was like she without. It was, and so the token gun, not just the type of gun, mattered, and it mattered for partly for instrumental reasons, the stock length, the sort of like the barrel length. My father insists that anything longer than a 26-inch barrel on a over and under shotgun, and you might as well be wielding a club against the pheasants. That's so they have strong views about that kind of thing. But those were their guns of choice in bird hunting.
Well, let me raise at least what I took to be part of the question, about the sort of rural focus, I guess I would really say, of I think some of the argumentation, and you even say sort of parenthetically one time, about the experience of gun owners, at least rural gun owners. So I think that may be, some of where the disjuncture is between, like, I deal mostly with urban and say suburban gun owners. And so is there a concern that the argument of the book is sort of overdetermined by a kind of rural experience, or even we speculated, and you feel free to speak about this or not, a minority sort of perspective, and even perhaps a persecuted religious minority perspective, if we can generalize from the original story you told. So how much of that inflects the argument?
Yeah, so let me say something that's sort of deflationary about this, which is I love the story about John Solomon Fulmer, just because it's just a weird story that it just so happens that my great grandfather was sort of like had this weird thing where it's just totally an artifact of history. It's not an important to the history, but I'm just interested in the story. But I don't now think and there's this sort of like very polarized view in America that rural identifiers sort of, and there's, Kathy Kramer has an excellent book about this in political science called The Politics of Resentment, where rural identifiers really sort of see themselves as persecuted. And I think that it's not a part of my view that view, that sort of that self-perception can sort of be vindicated by policy level facts. So it's not a part of my view that it really is true that the religious groups that I talk about, or that the political groups that I talk about, are persecuted as a matter of policy level fact. It is my view that those groups are misunderstood by academic philosophers, and that some of the policies that are favored by academic philosophers who don't believe in gun rights are perceived by those philosophers to not be a threat to the identity, but actually are a threat to the identity. And so what I'm interested in is kind of giving a philosophical exposition of where I think, given the psychology of rural identity, that those threats arise. Now, so it's not that I'm making claims about actual facts about oppression. I'm making claims about sort of like misunderstandings about how certain identity groups work. And about the point about the sort of narrowness of the group, I totally admit that. And it's a part of my view that groups can be philosophically interesting even if they lack much in the way of external validity. So if you were a social scientist and you were like, well, what's the external validity of this? I mean, there is some research on this now that tells us a little bit more, just in the last couple of years, the sort of like since this is published, about the external validity of it. And to a first approximation, I think that rural identifiers are going to turn out to have a somewhat different identity than people who actually are rural people themselves, which is going to suggest that the external validity is even more narrow than you might have supposed, because you might have thought that it would extend to everyone who identifies as rural, including some people who are not themselves living in rural areas. But in fact, my own view is that it's probably going to turn out that rural identifiers are even a little bit different than people who have rural backgrounds. So my view is external validity quite low, but still it's a kind of philosophically interesting group to investigate. That's my, what do you make of that? Is that
Yeah, I felt like, the sort of rights claim makes sense, actually, if you're looking at, a small minority group. That's the group that needs its rights defended most, right? Arguably. And, if you're in the majority, you're kind of okay. So, I feel like the philosophical argument is strengthened by, saying, hey, this is, I think you say at the end, the case for gun rights depends on appreciating values most people will never share, right? So even if this is a very small group, then their values still matter and connected to their personhood, and we don't want to, abolish people's personhood. So, as a social scientist, and I'm very interested in the empirical questions, but I also think a lot of sort of, I would call them minority gun owners, are ignored, by the mainstream of social scientists. So we know very, much less than we should about African American gun owners and LGBTQ gun owners and women gun owners, and so I can appreciate the importance of looking at these groups, and then I think that the question of the prominence of this rural view was something that was noted. I see Kirk has his hand up.
Just sort of a question for me. It makes a lot more sense now that you've discussed how narrowly scoped this was from a philosophical standpoint. No disrespect implied or intended, but is it possible that you scoped it to sort of simplify the answering process? Because it seems like you've taken this very narrow and inherently noble slice of gun owners. I refer mostly to the early story about the family who was able to create a shared identity with their trans child and sort of transcend that debate. And it seemed, I was reading it at the time, I was like, wow, this is heartwarming. This is great. I'm proud to be a gun owner. Oh, it, I won't ask were you cherry picking, but I'm in that sort of ballpark, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it was a great question. Oh, was somebody else going to add on to that?
Scott, were you as an add-on or separate to that?
I'm separate from that.
Okay.
So let me just say, this is a great question, and you're absolutely right. And so I'll just say that it's absolutely cherry picking. And here's what I'm after. So this is just sort of like the cards on the table. So that story is absolutely true, sort of like that, and actually the details, I sort of omitted some details of that story because the people involved are sort of like identifiable because it's a small community. And actually the details I think make the story look even better. But absolutely, the reason I chose that story to tell is I was trying to sort of motivate the idea for my imagined audience that there was at least a kind of possibility proof of a case where guns could play this sort of shared identity forming role. And absolutely, the fact that they can play that role doesn't tell us anything about the generality with which they play that role. Because it's the case is selected exactly to exhibit that point. So I think you're absolutely right as a way of noticing the limitation of the function of that story. And so what I'm really after is just being like, oh, look, can you see that there's a way in which this could work because I feel like my interlocutor might be skeptical that of sort of like even that this could happen at all. And so if I can just be like, oh, look, here's a way in which it works, that's not to dispute any of the sociology, which I think is really interesting, that, you know, sort of like rural gun owning communities have some serious problems. There's a variety of problems, and not to deny any of this. There's a lot of other important stories to tell about that. But it's just to kind of motivate that there's at least this possibility. And so it's really illustrative more than generalizing.
Yeah, you
Okay,
have
that
the,
makes sense.
yeah. You have a lot of gun owning experience in this group, so some of this may, you know, seem less significant to establish than for your average academic philosopher. Scott Estes, go ahead.
One of the things that I took from your book was that it was an extended meditation on the social contract. You know, that's Rawls' big thing in life. That's how he came back and came to fame. You also quote Kant and Locke. So how does this relate to your overall purpose in writing the book?
Yeah, good. No, good question. And so you're absolutely right that there's a kind of opponent that I have in mind, that I'm trying to get some purchase against. And that opponent is someone who does believe that there are personal rights in this sort of Rawlsian social contract kind of way, and who thinks that those personal rights extend to objects of personal property, but who deny that those objects include firearms in any case. And so if you're just the kind of public health utilitarian, I kind of say to that person, go in peace, because I understand that you're going to be thinking about this in a different way, and that some different considerations are going to be relevant. And that person doesn't really believe that there's any in principle personal rights to objects in any case. And so that person is just coming at it from a different angle. The person that I'm interested in is someone who says, no, there are personal rights, and those rights include the things that we need to exercise basic liberties. And now here's a schedule of basic liberties, and that's just going to exclude things like firearms. And then I'm like, I think that is going to be a tricky view to hold, because once you think about the reasons why stuff gets on that list, it's not because it's important to everyone. It's not because you need it for an instrumental reason. It's just because that those liberties play a certain kind of significant role in the exercise of capacities for some groups of people. And once you accept that structure, then I'm going to be like, man, it's going to be really difficult, I think, to show that that structure doesn't obtain, in at least some cases, for the exercise of a putative right to firearms. And so I think that social contract style theorist who does believe in rights, but wants to delimit the scope of rights to exclude any personal right to firearms, is going to really have a hard time telling the story about what got on the list and what stayed off the list. And so that's kind of that's the opponent that I imagine philosophically.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to jump forward to, oh wait, John, I'm going to defer to John. Go ahead, John Richardson, you have a question.
I do. How should we respond to the Benthamite utilitarians?
Yeah, good question. Now, let me give you two candidates and see what you think about it. So the Benthamite utilitarian is now most utilitarians nowadays are not hedonic utilitarians. They've got their view is gussied up in certain ways. But the public health utilitarian has something in common with the Benthamite utilitarian, and that what they're really just interested in is the prevention of harms to public health. And there's a lot of criminology work that's sort of like in this vein, that just sort of thinks that we should have regulations that are going to avoid harms to public health. And a lot of those people are, I think, skeptical about gun ownership, at least as it exists in the American context, where there's sort of private, personal ownership of firearms. And so I would say there's two lines that we could have against that person. If you're now, when I say we, of course you could disagree. One thing that we could say, well, it might well be, and it's very difficult to sort of look at the cross-national data, but it might well be that the optimal point for America to locate itself on policy-wise in terms of public health is going to be different than other countries, just because the currently existing supply of firearms is so high and the durability of firearms is so great. And that's very different than Australia. It's very different than most European countries. It's very different, dramatically different than Japan and so on. So America is unique in just the currently existing supply of firearms as such that it might be that the kind of public health utilitarian skepticism about guns is going to have to at least be applied differently in the United States than in other countries. The other way I think, and I'll sort of defer to Professor Humane about this, is that my sense is that, at least my sense of the sociology of violence is that America is different, not only in that there's more violence in America, there's a lot more gun violence in America, but there's also more non-gun violence in America. And so I feel like that, and that this doesn't settle anything yet, but the way in which violence is privately provided in America seems to be, to me, quite different than other countries. And that's not yet to say anything about what we should say about public health if you're just a utilitarian, but it's at least to suggest that what we might find is that the sort of optimal utilitarian set of policies in America is not going to be reliably predicted by sort of developed Western allies.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it to Kirk for a follow-up, but I will say that the non-gun homicide rate in the United States is higher than many, many other countries, to your point. Kirk, go ahead.
Possibly a quick follow-up. My question is, for purposes of this philosophical argument, change right to gun to right to violence, what change, if any, is there in the argument?
Oh, yeah, good. I think that there's much less, the grounds for a right to the personal or private provision of violence is much weaker than the right to personal firearms. So I think, for example, I'll give you a few examples of this. I think that rights to public space, to sort of like to privately display privately owned firearms in public spaces are much weaker than rights to the private ownership of firearms. I think that the rights to sort of like, like castle doctrine type rights, the sort of like rights to use private violence without a duty to retreat are much weaker than private rights to firearms. And the reason for this is I think, simple. It's just that once you start looking at the sort of public use of private firearms or the use of private firearms in the private provision of violence, that now we're affecting other people's rights extremely directly. And just the sort of classically liberal view that what the sort of policy level, the thing that we should do at the policy level is sort of satisfy people's rights together is now much more complicated. So I think that there's a much stronger term for the private ownership of firearms than there is for the private provision of violence, because there's a much better case to think that you can privately own firearms without immediately implicating the liberal rights of other persons than there is to think that you could privately provide violence without immediately implicating the rights of other persons.
Thank you.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, and I don't know if there were any criminologists with us tonight, if they felt like they were taking direct fire on their positions, but if any criminologists wanted to raise any response, that would be okay at this point.
I do a little bit, but I'm kind of marinating on it, David.
Okay, I'll just keep marinating, and I'll press forward because whenever we meet, I always try to make a point of having us read with the text that we're reading first, and then read against it, so that we have some appreciations that don't often come out in the Q&A section. So I'll just say for myself that there's a lot of I think subtlety and nuance in the book, which I appreciated, because a lot of what's written about guns is anything but subtle and nuanced. And So some of the points that I had just highlighted, we talked a lot about the 4 debate characters you set up, from the gun nut to the seer to the pluralist to the prohibitionist, and we thought that had some good value in trying to place different positions in these arguments. Your conclusion that it's a mistake to think about a single unified relationship between guns and social outcomes, I think, is really spot on. And again, one of our problems in discussing guns, I think, in the United States, is the desire to either make them all good or all bad, savior of democracy or destroyer of democracy. So appreciated that point quite a lot. The analogy between saving a child by not having a AR-15 and saving a child by not driving on Memorial Day was, I thought, a very strong point. And that guns can be used for domination and for resisting domination, and really both. So a lot of for me, anything that's a both and rather than a either or really is getting closer to the truth of the matter. But so you take on Furman D. Brander, his argument that guns don't make us free in chapter 8. And so you give various responses, so, radical racial authoritarianism and the civil rights movement. But I think the one example that I got hung up with, and maybe a couple others did, was the Bundy family. As is it ever plausible to think that the private ownership of guns could constrain the political state's exercise of political power? And I think one of, there may be many reservations, and others can certainly jump in. But my question was sort of, was it a good example because it was really another state actor, the courts, that was really decisive. And so maybe it wasn't so much that the Bundy family's arms were key to the resistance, but that the state just said, hey, fine, if you want to do it that way, we'll just take it through the courts. They ended up losing in the courts, but so then I think the courts maybe are more decisive than guns. So I'd just be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, sometimes, I mean, the Bundy case, I mean, let me just tell you, just for point of view of personal interest, is that probably my guess is that everybody else in the country, or sort of like just most people, sort of like have no sort of ex ante connection to the Bundy family. But the Bundy family, actually, like many people, like I myself know sort of like half a dozen or 10 members of the Bundy family. So knowing people who are sort of like 1 degree removed from the Bundys in Utah is like super common. So it's just a kind of a bit of personal curiosity that we're just interested in the sort of like the details of the case, because so many people in this particular idiosyncratic region where I am just sort of like it's have personal connections.
Yeah.
Now you're right, where it's like you're absolutely right. Where what happens in the story is that the courts intervene. And interestingly enough, an Obama-appointed federal judge sort of intervenes on behalf of the Bundy. So it's like one of these cases of sort of like sort of proceduralism, this kind of like the sort of like honoring the procedures, sort of like kind of having results that you might not have predicted if you had just sort of like looked at a kind of a crass view of political science or something. Now, the counterfact. So 2 things. One thing is that it's not part of my view that I'm saying it's morally justified to sort of like defend this particular schedule of rights claims against the BLM using firearms. The question is just, is it ever possible that the private use of firearms can modify the way the government acts? And so I'm sort of discharging the kind of justificatory question. I'm just asking a question like, can we imagine cases like this? Because some part of the skeptical case is like, there's no cases like this, the government's too powerful. But there's 2 things. One is that a curious thing is that the BLM does stand down. And of course, there's arrests later, the story is complicated, but the BLM does withdraw. And I feel like if you imagine the counterfactual version of the story where there were not armed protesters, it's very unclear to me if this, now, of course, it's we don't know the counterfactual, but it's at least not a crazy thought to think that the counterfactual would be different if the protesters were not armed. The second thing I would say is that the procedural complaints that are upheld in the Navarro opinion, the Navarro judgment, as I read that that document, has to do with things that the government does in response to the protesters being armed. So it might be that if the protesters, and again, this is conjecture, we don't know the counterfactuals, but given that what the government is sort of like gets in trouble for are sort of procedural violations that they take in virtue of responding to armed protesters, it's possible the government would have done something different had the protesters not been armed. Now you might say like there's not a lot to that case. All I'm trying to do is sort of make vivid the possibility as a conceptual matter that that private firearms could modify government decision making.
Scott, is this a follow-up to this line?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
What makes the difference in Bundy, to me, was what happened in Waco, because the government screwed up so badly in Waco when David Koresh's people got children killed that the government restrained itself even more and allowed the courts to get involved rather than bludgeoning their way in. And without Waco or Ruby Ridge, would the Bundy situation have worked out the way that it did, is my question.
No, that's a good question. I think you may well be right that there's a variety of factors that are counterfactually relevant in that thing. And again, if you're sort of like, if you're unimpressed by this case, that's okay. I think that the civil rights case is another case where sort of like state actors, and there's actual economics, there's economics supporting the idea that private gun ownership. So there's a lot more sort of like social scientific support of a real specification of a counterfactual. And so, I'm interested in this case because I'm friends with some people in the BLM and some people in the Bundy family. And so it's just a fascinating case to me. But I think you're right that there's a lot of things that had happened that could make the counterfactuals different.
Yeah. John, Paris, is this a direct follow-up on this line?
It is in a way,
Okay.
or maybe a professor's choice. The one, I guess, maybe a question or a comment was, would Bundy have evolved the way it did? Would his actions, would the family's actions have evolved without Waco or Ruby Ridge? So what, on both sides of the equation, there were driving factors that probably led to that thing. But I guess the one question, maybe a little bit counter, David, if appropriate, would be, this may have been an interesting book for the Why It's Okay series. Did you, my question is, as you were writing it, did you feel any pressures? Did you feel any constraints either from the publishers or your colleagues or anything like that to get to this point? Over.
My department chair asked me not to publish it until after I had tenure.
A prudent man.
I think that's a reality. I started studying guns after I was tenured and promoted to full professor and I advise many students who contact me, who have, less critical views of guns, not to pursue that as a line of research. I just don't think it's wise professionally, given the way things are. I want to go back to Tara, who wants to defend the honor of her discipline. That may be an overstatement.
I think that's an overstatement. I am the criminologist on the board. I'm also as one of the sociologists of gun ownership, and I see myself, Ryan, in your description of the audience that you were kind of targeting. I'm sort of on the edge of that public health utilitarian, but also the person that buys into the social contract. And this group will probably confirm that I do reference it a lot. And I really struggled. You really challenged me with the philosophical arguments. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a good point. I have lots of notes throughout. That's a good point. Yeah, this is really challenging. But then where I kind of pushed back as the criminologist and a sociologist who does a lot of survey research and data analysis, I really kind of bristled at some of the empirical evidence that you shared in the book, because I felt at times it was perhaps not representative of the extent of what sociologists know about gun ownership. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on both how you made decisions about what to encompass in terms of the empirical evidence that you shared, but then also how necessary is it at all to have the empirical economic information to go alongside the philosophical argument that I felt was a lot more compelling, as opposed to me getting lost in the well, actually that's an outdated stat, or that's not quite right, or that person is discredited. So
Yeah. Well, I guess so first of all, my out of the gate response is concessive on this, that I'm and so I'd be interested also in sort of like getting, if you don't mind my emailing you, I'd be interested in your, because I'd be interested in your, like what you because you're absolutely right that I'm not a sociologist, and I also I'm not really even a qualified empirical social scientist. So just as a kind of disclosure, I do some empirical work, but it's all experimental. So I really am just kind of lost in observational work, which means that I feel much better myself if I have because, like, it's just sort of like, between you and me, it's like experimental work is the analysis is much easier. So it's kind of like
yeah.
there's some time issues, which means that, and of course it's like you can't do experimental work about the actual consequences of any of this stuff, which means all I can really talk about are the sort of identity facts, because that's the
Yeah.
sort of, because all you're getting is attitudinal stuff from your experimental treatments. So
Mhm.
totally right. Where it's like, no, I did go through as sort of like, as I was reading this book, and I tried to read the empirical literature on it, but because I am not a social scientist, and because I'm especially not a social scientist of observational data, then I really am. So I do two things. I read the empirical work, and I basically just don't have. And so, like, you, I'm sure, can make sort of like make choices about sort of like whether analysis decisions are better or worse. But I'm not making those choices. I'm just kind of like, well, here's the kind of clutter of
Mhm.
analyses that are given. And then I looked at some of the meta-analysis, like the Rand Corporation has a meta-analysis. And they're like, well, it does, and they do recommend, they do think that there's a series of gun policies that they think are well credentialed,
Mhm.
based on the meta-analysis that they have of the data. And like I say, I have no chops to be disputing any of that. Um, uh, I think you're right that some of the studies that I call attention to are studies that seem like they're suggesting that you can get some results. You can get some significant results in ways that seem like they would be sympathetic to the gun owner. And I do call
Mhm.
more attention to those studies, I think, because my interlocutor, as I imagine them, just sort of thinks that there's nothing on that side, thinks that there's only this sort of old sort of like, Watts and Kleck sort of things where they're like, oh, it's totally discredited. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
there's still some stuff in the 2010s. It seems like there's some observational results that are interesting on that. But as you can tell, my response to you is going to be modest on this.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I don't know whether John Paris was alluding to any of this at all, but on this empirical data question, you do have the two empirical chapters, 5 and 6, one on the effects of gun ownership and one on policy. Were those chapters that you had always planned to include, or was there someone along the way who said, oh, you should at least address some of the empirical reality, because as you say, this is maybe not within your wheelhouse? And I think some of those chapters triggered the social scientists among us, me not, maybe not necessarily negatively, but I was definitely in the footnote or the end notes, sort of double checking, like, oh, who is he citing on this point, who is he citing on this point? because there's a lot of material out there.
Oh yeah. But now tell me, just out of curiosity, what were the things, so I can take it, but I'm just interested, like what were the things where you're like, oh, where it seems like I'm saying something and you're like, no, that's sort of like, that's not state of the art now. Because I'm open to correction on that business.
The statement about mass shootings at schools, school shootings, that's something we actually talked about at our last meeting that jumped out to both David and I as you underrepresenting the extent of school shootings.
And so there's some literature that, now this may be where it's just sort of like I'm behind the times, where my understanding was that the incidence of mass shootings at schools had increased, but that schools were still safer than against a sort of like, 30-year baseline or something like that. Is that no longer true?
I mean, my take is that the overall point is fair to say, which is that, there's not very many students who are dying in school shootings at any time.
Yeah.
But that the is just that the number seemed inaccurate, and I think in a lot of the field is so contested that whenever you see an inaccurate number, it just raises red flags about, oh, well, if that one's not right, maybe some of the others aren't right either. And so I think that's where I get like kind of an over sensitivity to that. And I'm flipping through my notes as fast as I can here to try to find the sections of the text where I guess I'd say my general sort of reaction to the empirical parts, because I spend most of my time in that world, was that it's sort of cruising along the surface. Although I mean, you did pick up a really impressive number of works for someone who doesn't work in that area. So I guess it's like a half empty, half full issue to some extent. And I thought it was bold to go down that path, but it did also make me wonder, like, oh, I wonder if someone along the way, a peer reviewer or an editor said, hey, it would really be good for you to address the policy issues, right? Because the question of whether it's okay to own a gun can be argued without addressing either the empirical reality of guns and negative outcomes or policy prescriptions, right? Because that's a separate question. If you can, I mean, as I think you say at some point, like all kinds of horrible things could happen with guns and people could still have a right to guns.
Yeah, no, that kind of is my view. And so I think you're right. And I'm, like I said, I'm interested in sort of corresponding more by email or something for like, oh, so I appreciate you're raising this. And I did have that sense at the time, where it's like, if you ask me sort of like what the state of the philosophical literature is on something, where it's just like, man, I can just tell you, I just know everything that's happened. And it's just not true. And so I did read through a bunch of this, but it's like, and I looked at some of the meta-analyses, but I think you're right, where it's sort of like, it just doesn't, I'm sure to a professional, it just sounds like an outsider. Yeah, I think that. So I take your point. And it is, and just to your question, somebody did recommend to me in the review process. And I try to be concessive to the public health utilitarian, being like, that person just may not be on the same journey I'm on, because they may sort of not share enough of the initial premises, given the empirical facts. But maybe I should be more concessive to that person.
Well, Tara would appreciate it.
I don't know if you need to cater to the public health person, because I don't think you're ever going to convince them. So you're more likely to convince the social scientists among us that are kind of able to engage in these thought experiments a little bit more than a public health utilitarian who would just automatically shut it all down.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I'm interested because I did end up signing up to go to this national research conference on gun violence. I can't remember the title. I don't have it here, but the big 3-day conference. There's apparently over 400 presentations that are going to be made all on the issue of gun-related negative outcomes. So it'll be interesting to see these people, I guess, public health utilitarians, all in their native context. So John has his hand up, and then I have one sort of general question I'd like to conclude with. So, Tovis is going to try and jump in too. So, all right, John, keep it
Yeah,
brief.
this is just a really simple question. Do you consider yourself a political theorist or political philosopher?
Oh, I consider myself a philosopher. Mostly I don't even write about politics. I'm mostly just interested in sort of Canberra Plan style conceptual analysis.
So, excellent. John is reliving his graduate school days.
Undergraduate. That was my
Undergraduate.
only C in political science.
Tovis, go ahead.
How long have you wanted to write this book?
I wanted to write it for a long time. So this is a sort of quick personal aside, but when I got to graduate school, I was in a relationship with someone who it turned out just sort of like we had no common ground about this. And, it was just, I wasn't experienced in thinking that I hadn't sort of experienced people sort of saying like, oh, the stuff I really cared about should be against the law. And they sort of like thought that I was also really wrong. And so I just sort of encountered like really sharp disagreements, like my first year of graduate school. And so I've kind of wanted to say my spiel about it.
Right. Well, my last question by way of wrapping up is one that I ask everybody that I interview about their books, which is, did your mind change at all in the process of working on the book, or was it more sort of just expressing and refining what you thought going in?
The thing that you actually that you and Tara Warner have pressed me on is the thing about which my mind was sort of like the most wishy-washy, because the more that I got into the observational results, the more that I realized that like I could not really make very authoritative pronouncements about the observational results. And so I myself am really firm on the personal right, because I have a view about rights that's kind of, very different than the utilitarian view. But it made me, the thing that I sort of started with beliefs about was that I could sort of like get a handle on the sort of multi-dimensional problem of what the configuration of policies was that would be optimal. And then I kind of lost confidence in my ability to get a handle on that configuration of policies that would be optimal, where by optimal, I mean in a kind of utility way.
Yeah, well, I think we all learned a lot from the effort in any event, and really thinking about the whole range of possible policies, that designed to regulate firearms. So that we conclude with our appreciation of that, our appreciation of the book overall. I don't think any one of us in here is a professional philosopher, but we were able to read and mostly understand. Although I still, the trolley problem is one that I'm trying to get my mind around. But we appreciated the rigor of your argumentation and the view you presented, and really appreciate you spending some time with us tonight. I want to thank all the attendees, our unsung heroes who we don't get to see your faces, but you're in there every week. And our panelists, thanks. We'll be in touch about where we're going to next. But Professor Davis, thank you so much for your time and the education you provided us.
Thanks so much for reading this. Like I say, it really means a lot to me that you spent time, and I appreciate your reactions. And if there's other things where people are like, oh, dissatisfied with this or that, I'd be happy to talk more on email or get updates to my own view. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, and good night.